Welcome to A Slice of SEL, a podcast for educators about social emotional learning.
Welcome to A Slice of SEL. We're the SEL team at the St. Croix River Education District. I'm Nick.
I'm Angela.
And I'm Kevin.
We're back, guys. I feel like we're the Sanderson sisters in Hocus Pocus. Today is going to be a shorter episode. I say that every time in my head, but I'm really feeling it today. We just want to share 5 techniques for how to respond to disruptive student behavior. And these are coming from Scott Ervin. He's nicknamed the Kid Whisperer. He just has like a particular flavor of love and logic that he's adapted over the years since he was a teacher. And it's funny enough because we actually wrote this outline for this podcast episode last spring, and then fancy it like enough, we got way too busy to actually record it. And then I found myself during workshop week this August at North Branch Area Middle School, where Scott was speaking to their entire staff all day long in a session. And then during a break in that session, a teacher came over to me and said like, hey, we were talking about your podcast yesterday, and are you guys still doing it? Because we didn't see an episode since March. And I was like, yes, we will continue doing the podcast. And in fact, we will be doing an episode about Scott. So there's just a lot of serendipity going on right now. And yeah, so these 5 techniques are coming from Scott Ervin. And just a little recap, like he was, for the first 11 years of his teaching career, he requested that the most difficult students in their grade level be placed in his section, in his room as a teacher. And then for the last 5 of those 11 years, he worked at the largest primary school in the United States, and he requested that, again, all of the most difficult students out of the 400 third graders be placed on his class roster. And he had the highest standards for behavior and also had really good academic data. And it was funny hearing him talk because he was saying like, I'm not very good at pedagogy, at academic pedagogy. I'm not the fanciest, most adept person at lesson design or construction, but he was talking about how important behavior management is to academic outcomes, which we all know, but I like the way he phrased it, which I won't do as well as he did, but he was like, my 95 to 100% engagement and instructional time where the class is calm and working together with my poor pedagogical skills will beat your 70% of the time with your incredible pedagogical skills. And that's why this behavior management is so impactful on academic outcomes, which I think is like a good way of phrasing it. I was like, yeah, that's true. Like we do lose so much instructional time from disruptive behavior. So Scott did write an article, he has so much to teach people, but an article for the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development, and it explains 5 strategies for responding to disruptive behavior. And that's what we're going to be covering on the podcast today. And of course, we're going to link in that article into our show notes, and we encourage you to check it out. Now, why are we talking about this today, gang? So when we originally outlined the episode last spring, students were kind of at that point in the year in April or May they were done being in school. Like their stamina for a whole school year from the pandemic had really been thrown off. So it was like, all right, we're ready to be done with this year and there's 2 months left. So there was a lot of disruptive behavior happening. But right now in September, approaching October, we're past the honeymoon for this school year. And I am certainly hearing about disruptive behavior that teachers are navigating. So I think this is going to be a relevant episode, gang.
Yeah, I definitely think so. But before we get into that, let's talk about what's filling our buckets this week. I'll start. Right now, I'm feeling very fulfilled by some of the really great conversations I've been having with building teams. We're talking about their social behavior programming and really looking at data to make decisions on how to improve that social behavior continuum of supports for students. So just makes me really, really hopeful and excited for our collaborative work ahead of us for the school year.
Yeah, it's nice when the data analysis feels like it's actually getting us somewhere and helping us be effective versus feeling like, oh God, we just got to do this or check a box.
Mm-hmm. So, making it meaningful for teams to really use it to make those decisions. Yeah.
What's filling my bucket is God, this is so thoughtful. A teacher at East Central Elementary School shared a video with me of her students practicing an SEL skill using a Be Good People lesson. And it just like made my entire week. It just made me so happy. It's just so nice to get to see that. So,
Yeah.
That's awesome. And for me, filling my bucket, fall time itself just fills my buckets. I mean, there's bonfires, the leaves are changing. I'm an avid hunter, so getting out in the woods is just very therapeutic. And all the things up here. I mean, I live up in the East Central School District, and the fall time just brings energy to the area, and I just love it.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. I wish it could stay this way all year long. So we're going to shift to our main topic. So we're going to share Scott's 5 tips. And Scott frames this by saying that when a student engages in a disruptive behavior, a teacher's 2 natural reactions might be to A, ignore it, or B, do a declarative statement like stop talking. And he calls these 5 tips, his term for them is gentle guidance interventions, or GGIs. And they're basically gentle ways of prompting the student to get back on track. And he advises that they're effective because, for one thing, like, they don't embarrass the student or make it confrontational, make it a power struggle, and put that student in a position where they have to save face in front of their peers. And if this sounds familiar, good. I mean, it did to the 3 of us, which is, frankly, why we're sharing it. And on our SEL website, we have a chart of all the increasingly intense ways. Like I've talked to so many teachers and principals about this, like just the generic kind of continuum of in a classroom from like just simple proximity all the way up to like having a conference or like a private chat one-on-one with a kid back and forth, all the way up to even like referral to a stop and think room. There's such a continuum of different responses that we have in our toolbox. And there's just a million different jargony terms from across speakers and frameworks and stuff for what that continuum exactly is. But there's just so much common ground there of just stuff that works. And it's more about getting to just that, like, what is the stuff that works? It doesn't matter too much what we call it, but it's just what is the stuff that works. So like gestures, think of gestures, like nonverbals, different kinds of verbal statements. So Scott's going to get into that stuff. That's what he's talking about here, just like the tools in your toolbox. And what I really liked about what he said when I got to see him speak live, I just love this so much. He did it right at the outset. He was talking to the experienced teachers in the room, and he was like, you guys, I'm not going to pretend like you don't have anything in your toolbox. You're teachers who have been at this for years and years, and you've been accumulating and building your craft. So if I share something with you and you're like, no, I like the way I do this better, like, don't take what I have. I'm not expecting you to. I just really like that frame because like our team was talking about there's so much craft and nuance, and it is about taking tips that are shared with you and then integrating it into your craft. And it's just, it's really funny because like earlier this week, guys, I was getting interviewed for a book, and one of the people interviewing me was like a very experienced PBIS researcher. And we talked about pre-correction is like a really high frequency used, super common jargony phrase for a particular kind of prompt that we do like when we're transitioning from one activity to another, and kind of basically giving kids a heads up about, hey, this is a really important expectation to keep in mind as we head into this activity. And it's usually called pre-correction. And I was saying, oh yeah, I love that. Absolutely. And I love it so much. When I talk to so many teachers across buildings, pretty much all of them say, hey, preventative reminders is a way better term for this. And she was like, oh yeah, absolutely. And that kind of illustrates why language is so important. And it's just like, there's different things that we can call the same thing, but it's just important to know like what it is and then build that into your craft. So there's just really not a lot of new, I guess is what I was saying. So anyhow, gang, I mean, that's absolutely right. Like, that's something many teachers know, that kind of by avoiding this power struggle and this confrontation with a student and forcing that student into a position where like socially they have to save face, we can avoid a lot of blow-ups and keep them from happening in the first place. And the way to do that is using our less intense tools in our toolbox. So with all that said, let's get to some of those tips from Scott.
Okay, so number 1 is the confused eye. So what you do is you establish that eye contact with the student while giving the most confused look that you can muster. With just that one look, this intervention then separates that student from that behavior. It says to that student, "You're so wonderful," and that behavior is not wonderful. What's happening? I'm confused. Now, guys, I think you'll recognize this as just a subtle variation of like what's called the teacher look. That standard teacher look gives that, oh, no, vibe. While like Scott's confused eye, he explained it in the article that it just sends the ever so slightly different message to the student, like, "Hey, what? I did not expect this of you. I expect great things from you."
I'm laughing because he live demoed, of course, exactly what this looks like. And it was really just like the most confused look he could muster. He had a very expressive Jim Carrey-like face, just like, woo!
Okay, so number 2 is Contraband Tap. In classrooms, we might not allow cell phones, trading cards, or food or other items. Scott makes a point that directly ordering students to give up these items really creates a power struggle for many teachers.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just like a nightmare. And like, if I can jump, when we outlined this episode last spring again, I had just been like working with a group of middle school teachers who were discussing and kind of like looking at revising their cell phone policy. And it's just everybody wants a magic bullet for that, and everybody kind of wishes we could put mobile phones back in the box, because it's such an issue that teachers and principals have to think very strategically about how to best handle that throughout every context in the school day. And they just are really intentionally trying to figure out solutions that don't involve these predictable, consistent power struggles that wear away at their relationships with their class.
Right. So say you work in a school where students are allowed to carry devices as long as they put them away in their backpack or in their pocket once class starts. Say that Ben is sitting there 3 minutes into class with a Snapchat pulled up. Well, Scott's Contraband Tap is, instead of making a direct demand to Ben to put his phone away, simply tapping the phone while walking by can give Ben an opportunity to put it away while saving face. Scott advises to only look at the item long enough to make eye contact with your fingers and just give that 2 gentle taps on the object, and never make eye contact with the student, since this could invoke one of those power struggles. He also says it's best to not stop moving before, during, or after the tap, just to kind of keep it flowing. And the point is to make this a momentary interaction, very brief and not a stare down.
Right. And I really love how he includes those small little details, and like he put those in the article, but also when I got to see him live in August, like throughout the entire day, whether it was him talking or him responding to teachers' questions, he would always talk about why, and he would talk about like, hey, I tried it this way, and then I realized I kept having issues with this, or teachers were reporting issues with this small little nuance of it. So he really got into like the nitty-gritty of like physically your speed when you're walking and how that can change what that feels like for most students. And then like the specific words you're using. And I think that all comes back again to craft. And like this thing he's talking about, the specific term, like a contraband tap. At first I read it, I don't like jargon. I was just like, what the heck is this? But it's really just like one specific example or flavor of like a gestural prompt. I mean, I think pretty much all of us have done that, where like you might tap on a student's desk. I think most teachers have done that at one point or the other. They're just like quickly walking by and like tap on a desk really subtly. You might like make eye contact with a student, like point to your class expectations poster, or a lot, like every elementary school in our member districts now has a voice level poster, which is high, again, celebration. But like they can like quickly just tap that and tap a voice level versus like having to say something or call students out. So it's just like those gestures that are completely nonverbal that are less likely to like stoke the fire and make something blow up. Mm-hmm. So that brings us to tip number 3 of the 5, is called the assumption of intelligence. And I think there's like some fanciful fun like phrasing with how Scott has picked these phrases that he likes. But he makes the point, and he did live to those middle school teachers, like 99% of the time when we tell students to do something, they do already know what they should be doing, what the expectation is. And he was talking about how, you know, when we tell students to throw away their food or put away their materials because the bell rang, we find ourselves doing those things. And if it's especially like after the first couple weeks or even the first couple months of the school year, like we should have gone over our rituals and routines really, really clearly at the beginning of the school year. So students should be crystal clear and have a lot of predictability with like what we're expecting, rituals and routines in our room. Like, especially if you've put time into that, teachers will say in meetings, like I'll say to students, like, we've been doing it this way all year. I know you know it. So I've heard teachers say that explicitly, like that's what they want to say to their students. Like, we've been doing it this way all year. I know you know it. So yeah, that's basically what Scott is getting at here. So it's just, how do you actually say that to the student? Because we want to, again, say it in a way that's not going to like blow up in our face. So when he's saying the assumption of intelligence, his strategy is literally just this phrase, like calmly, neutrally saying, you know what to do. And he advises you say that in passing, again, like not confronting the student face to face, but just kind of like walking by them without eye contact. You know what to do. And I love how he emphasizes, again, those small details of non-verbally how to present these phrases. Because I think what he's picturing is like student, leaves trash on the floor and you just walk by and say, like, you know what to do.
Yeah, agreed. Number 4 is statement of fact. This is a simple statement where you're saying something that's true, but it shouldn't be true. I'll say that again. So you're saying something that is true and obvious, but it should not be true. It should not be happening. So here's a few examples from Scott. One example is your desk has stuff under it, or the learners have some things to do before our afternoon meeting. Another example is there's a coat on the floor, or the learners still have mail in their mailboxes. Again, he's just aiming for phrases that are going to prompt students to do what they're supposed to do without nagging or embarrassing them, really allowing them to save that face.
Yeah, and again, like the conversation throughout that day was so cool to hear, because he really did talk about the nuances of phrasing and just how that impacts your relationship with students and your likelihood of getting in a power struggle. Like, a lot of it was just phrases that's why he calls them gentle guidance interventions. Like, it's just these lower intensity ways of encouraging students to take that appropriate expected path to follow our rituals and routines without making it an order that is more likely to blow back at you. And just to interject, there's one technique that he did not include in this article, but I know he just adores. He actually calls it the perfect intervention. So if he included 5 in this article, I don't know why he left this one out, because he calls it the perfect intervention. And I was so happy when I heard him explain it, because this is like my favorite kind of response strategy too. It's when you're guiding some students to get back on track while giving affirmative attention to other students. So it's an indirect prompt. And the examples you gave, Angela, like you said, your desk has stuff under it. So instead of saying that to the student whose desk has a mess underneath it, who needs to clean up their desk, I might say, Beth, another student, I might be talking to another student, like, Beth, I noticed how clean the floor under your desk is. So by talking to Beth and giving that affirmative attention to Beth, you might call that praise. I mean, I'm noticing something positive about what Beth is doing. By doing that, I'm at the same time cueing the student with a mess under their desk to clean it up. So he calls it he calls it noticing misdirect, which isn't my favorite jargon he has, because I was sitting next to 2 teachers who were like really getting twisted around and like, what did that mean again? And you would know, Angela, I had religiously taken incredibly detailed notes, so like I was able to help. But you could, like, an indirect prompt is usually what I call it. Again, he also calls it like the perfect intervention. My favorite thing is, because we're from Minnesota, to call it a twofer, because like that's how I always remember it. It's a twofer, because like you're praising and giving this positive spotlight on one student or a group of students, whoever is kind of like meeting that expectation, and at the very same time you're giving this subtle cue to the students who aren't, to like course correct. So just you accomplish 2 things at once. That's why he calls it the perfect intervention. So sorry, I just wanted to slip that one in because it's such a good one.
Yeah, thanks.
Right, Nick. Those indirect prompts are great. And everything of what we've talked about is achieving that same objective, to guide the students back on track without putting them in an embarrassing position where they're likely to push back. So finally, number 5 is just asking the question, what should you be doing?
Yeah, and of course, just to jump in here, like voice tone is really important. And that goes for all of these things, of course. Like we talked about how much Scott hammered on like how important nonverbals were, but like you need to avoid patronizing the student and having any sarcasm in your voice, because it doesn't matter what words you're using and how carefully you select them if your voice tone is giving off that judgmental, what should you be doing? And the tip is really similar. Like Scott has like 40 or 50 of these gentle guidance interventions. His article we're referencing only pulled 5 of them, but like a lot of them are very similar, that it's just shades of similar things. So the phrase that I offered earlier in this episode is you know what to do, kind of like the student had stuff under their desk and it's like, you know what to do. The one that Kevin's offering is just slightly different, like what should you be doing?
Yeah, in this case, we know they have the skills. We're confident that the student knows the expectation, and that's a big part of this. Rather than telling them to do it, we can put the onus on them and ask them, what should you be doing?
Yeah, and like that's a really critical point to make, Kevin, is just that I mentioned rituals and routines earlier. Like when he's talking about craft and your toolbox and how all these things work, like they rely on each other. So like you can use this if you've made it really clear what your rituals and routines are and practice that with students so that you're really confident that this student knows what they should be doing. And then you're in a situation where it's like, oh yeah, I don't need to like nag them like with my phrasing. My phrasing can be a little bit more soft and just like, what should you be doing? Or you know what to do. And again, your voice tone matters with how you say that. This is all an art. That's, teaching is a craft and an art. That's why like Angela brought up, like there's a certain way you would talk to your child that you wouldn't with a student in your classroom, and particularly a student with high needs. So like Scott did make the point throughout the day, which I appreciated and others did. Like he would say, this works for 95% of your students. If you do it exactly the way I'm teaching you, I don't expect you to like know it. But now that I've taught you how to do it, like it'll work for 95% of your students if you're doing it the way I'm teaching you. But for 5% of students, do it this way. And he would offer like slight variations. So you might need more explicitness for a student who truly doesn't remember. Even if you've practiced and practiced the rituals and routines, they might need a more explicit directive reminder. They might actually need that. But that's the nature of, the continuum of supports we provide students. That's why Be Good People's, core edition for Tier 1, universal instruction, for high schoolers looks dramatically different in how much practice and guidance and explicitness and directiveness there is versus what we would use for students with disabilities, because they need different levels of support. So to wrap it up, gang, let's talk takeaways. This feels familiar, like what we did last year, getting back into the swing of podcasting. So to recap, the Kid Whisperer's 5 tips for responding to disruptive behavior. Number 1 was that confused eye. So basically the teacher look that we all know and love, but just that confused Jim Carrey-ish kind of goofy face says like, I didn't expect that from you. What? Like, I know you can get it together. A contraband tap is really just like a flavor of the gestures that we use, like the little taps we might do it on a student's desk. It's just like he gave the example of a device or a phone that shouldn't be out, which is a very common problem-solving thing teachers are dealing with. And just to like very quickly walk by, double tap it without making eye contact, not making it a big confrontation, but just like a very gentle reminder to put it away. The assumption of intelligence was just literally that phrase, like, you know what to do. And statement of fact is, pointing something out that shouldn't be happening. And again, it's just another gentle way of reminding that student of what they should do in an indirect, gentle way. So it could be saying like, well, the learners have some picking up to do in the backpack area before we get started with lesson. And number 5, the last one we talked about, was that just variation, like, what should you be doing? And it's just that short, simple question that, again, is giving them that gentle prompt to course correct. And again, just to come back from that to that frame of how we initially talked about things, like, again, this is all on a continuum. So like, I'd say probably the least intensive thing a teacher can do when there's, inappropriate behavior is like proximity, just like moving your body to be closer. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's like what teachers might call a conference or a private chat, kind of like pulling the student aside and talking one-on-one. And then there's even like, referral out of the classroom. But it's a spectrum of how intense you're responding. And Scott is just guiding us to be aware of the big toolbox of strategies we have in that lower intensity region. Because when we can use those and have the student respond to those kind of gentle, indirect ones, they're a lot less likely to, again, put that student on the spot, make them have to save face, create the potential, the spark for that power struggle, which is what we want to avoid. And again, last reminder is just what he said, like these are just tips that you might want to integrate into your existing craft, or you might want to leave them. He just really hammered home that you're an experienced teacher. If your way of doing some of these things is better than Scott's, then just continue to do that. And guys, thank you for teaching. You're truly remarkable. So thank you.
And thanks for spending time with us today. Make sure to subscribe, and if you're on YouTube, click the bell so that you are notified when our new episodes are released. We'll see you when you come back for another slice of SEL.
Thanks, guys.
Bye now.
Bye.